Well, hi, everyone. As you know, we're kind of going through some of the segments of events that we had associated with this event called Believe in Our City that we did recently here in Grand Rapids. And one of them was a sit-down that I had with Jeff Rosen. Jeffrey Rosen is the CEO of the National Constitution Center. He's been on the podcast before. He's an incredibly thoughtful person when it comes to, obviously, the Constitution and the founding of our country and the ideas and the heart and soul behind it, the positives and the negatives, and some of the things that we as a country have faced that have really been damaging. We started some things really, really well, and we did some things really poorly. And we tried to have an honest conversation about that with the idea that we recognize the challenges that we've had with our past, but as it says in the Constitution, we want to pursue being more perfect. How do we get better? How do we improve? How do we take things forward? So it was we had a really great night. We had dinner conversations that were going on during that time. Everybody kind of had a topic at each table that we had at the event. So each conversation was held, recorded. We tried to really have this rich in content, and then Jeffrey kind of brought it all home for us. So he's a wonderful friend and a great person to talk about these issues, and I'm sure you're going to enjoy it.
We believe and have always believed in this country that man was created in the image of God, that he was given talents and responsibilities and was instructed to use them to make this world a better place in which to live. And you see, this is the really great thing of America.
It's time to discover what binds us together, and finding it has the power to transform our world. That's what I believe. How about you?
Jeff is absolutely brilliant. And I got to make sure we sell this big.
Let's undersell it, please.
Yeah. I've had so much fun at the National Constitution Center. I got involved about a little over 20 years ago when the center opened. We went to the opening there, and it became something that I just really wanted to stay close to. Was able to join the board, and Jeff is still stuck with me. He can't get rid of me. I still keep hanging around the organization, because I love the conversation. One of the main things that Jeff's done, and he's been in Grand Rapids before, some of you may have seen him, is he takes us to conversation at a constitutional level. Mayor, you talked a little bit about the election season and what we're going to be dealing with and how that can be dividing. And Jeff always raises the conversation to constitutional issues that really challenge us to think. And while we may not say, well, I've changed my mind to think this way about an issue or to think that way about an issue, at the end of the day, he'll ask the question, do you have a better understanding of the other side? And that's when every hand in the room goes up. So Jeff, I really appreciate that, and really thank you for taking the time to join us here tonight as we talk about some constitutional issues and how it relates, as Joe said, to us here in Grand Rapids and West Michigan. And I like that phrase, Joe, the 616. I like that. We're going to steal that one too. There's tension in the room whenever you start to talk about issues where it's working good for one group and not good for another group. And however you want to make that division, there's tension. And there's a lot of history that we all bring with us when we think about some of these issues. And our country has to wear that. And Jeff, I want to ask you, as we start to kind of deal with that a little bit, because at the end of the day, we're all Americans. Talk to us about why the National Constitution Center was established, and why should we care about the Constitution, and why should everybody care about it? Because I may be in a situation where that's a million miles away from me. Here's what I'm dealing with in my life. Here's what I'm dealing with, things that have been unfair. Here's where there's history that is putting me in a position that's keeping me from reaching my potential. Help us understand how we could maybe think about the Constitution in that light.
Well, first of all, Doug, it is an honor to be here in Grand Rapids. It is so inspiring to see how you've convened all of these people of different perspectives and backgrounds for thoughtful conversations about the future of your community. And thank you so much for including the National Constitution Center in it. Why should we care about the Constitution? Because the alternatives is the mob. That was why the Constitution was established. Why did they come to Philadelphia in 1787? Because there were farmers mobbing the federal bankruptcy courts in western Massachusetts during Shays' Rebellion. And the farmers couldn't pay their debts after the Revolutionary War, and there's an inflation, and they want to shut down the courts and use violence. And James Madison comes to Philadelphia, and he says, in all large groups of any character composed, passion never fails to wrest the scepter from reason. Even if every Athenian had been Socrates, Athens would still have been a mob. Because he's afraid that when people get together and face to face and make decisions based on passion rather than reason, then the rule of law is threatened. And that's why he defines a faction as any group, a majority or a minority, animated by passion rather than reason. And Hamilton says in Federalist 1, the whole point of the Constitution is to test the experiment of whether it's possible to establish a government based on reason and conviction and not force or violence. So those are the stakes, and that's why the Constitution was established. We've seen at crucial moments throughout American history that this experiment has been in danger of collapsing to mob violence and insurrection. And it happened right before the Civil War. And there's that amazing speech from Lincoln, the young Lincoln, 1838, addressed to the Springfield Lyceum. He warns of the danger of king mob. He uses the phrase 7 times. There are abolitionists being killed. There are black men being lynched. There are the country is several decades away from splitting apart over segregation and Civil War and slavery, the stain of slavery. And Lincoln says, unless we whisper to our children the importance of learning about the Constitution and the will of law, then the whole thing is going to collapse. And you can just see it again and again. We're in very serious times today. We know that. And national politics are more polarized than they've been at any time since the Civil War. This is very serious about whether the American experiment is going to endure. And if it is, the only way will be by doing just what Lincoln said, just learning to and clinging to and embracing the principles of the Constitution of the United States.
Jeff, talk about, as you can see, Jeff's pretty good and passionate about this. All right, as he goes. Let's talk about the rule of law. And let's start at the beginning. So let's start with the Declaration. And one of my first events, Akil Amar said there's a fold in history where the time of the Constitution and that time where human freedom reigned, but it didn't. Talk about how we stumbled out of the gates, and how could we have, in one sense, as a country, talked about the ideas of freedom so wonderfully, and on the other side, miss it so badly.
Well, it's so important to start with the Declaration, because that, as Lincoln said, is the apple of gold around which the Constitution's frame of silver is wrapped. And the Declaration, equality, liberty, democracy, those shining ideals that define the American idea. And although we've disagreed about much, we're committed to liberty, equality, and democracy. But from the beginning, there was a basic hypocrisy, and that was slavery. How was it possible that these men who declared all are created equal could, some of them themselves, own slaves? The remarkable thing is they didn't even try. You know, I've just done this book about the pursuit of happiness and looking at how the founders practiced the virtues that they preached. And there's this incredible speech from Patrick Henry where he's just given the give me liberty or give me death speech. And he says, is it not amazing that I myself, who believe that slavery violates the Declaration of Independence, myself own slaves? He said, I will not try, I won't even attempt to. It's simple avarice or greed I can't do with the inconvenience of living without it. Wow, and that was it. Just really honest, really candid in this moment of truth and self-awareness. I know it's wrong, but I like the lifestyle, and I don't want to give it up. Wow, and that's what Jefferson said, the same thing, in moments of self-awareness. But it's striking, none of them in that generation tried to justify it. They said, yes, it is a violation of the promise that all men are created equal. In the next generation before the Civil War, you had some people starting to say, well, the Declaration was wrong to say all men are created equal. It was a self-evident lie or a glittering generality. And it was Jefferson's grievous error to put those words into the Declaration. And John Calhoun said slavery is a positive good. He starts defending it. But that wasn't the case for the founders. And that's why it's, and it was David Walker who, in his appeal to black people, said, let's make the promise of the Declaration a reality. And let's actually, this is actually amazing. He says, let's give this book of Jefferson's, where he expresses these racist sentiments on the state of Virginia, to every black son, so they'll know what the hypocrisy is and they'll fight against it and hold America to its own principles. So the history is not pretty always. It's very, very jarring, and there's hypocrisy. But there's always the ideal, and that shining ideal is vindicated. And Frederick Douglass invokes it. What to a slave is the 4th of July. And Lincoln invokes it. And then the war came, as Lincoln says, and it's written into the Constitution in the 14th Amendment. And then there's a backlash of redemption. And then there's segregation. And then there's the Civil Rights Movement. And then there's King on the Mall, saying, let's make the promise of the Declaration a reality. And that's the story of American history. It is a constant back and forth, but the arc does point upward, as King says. And Doug, we've just got to learn the history. Just read Walker's appeal, read the Declaration, read Patrick Henry. You can't learn enough history, and when you do that, you have a sense that, as you started off by saying, you know, it's not perfect, and we've got a lot of failures to learn from, but the arc is always upward.
You know, Jeff, thank you for that, because I think it's important for all of us to recognize whatever we've done, whatever our past is our past, and it's brought us to where we are. And I think that's the tension that's important for us to deal with as a community and put on the table, and to not stop fighting for what's right, not stop working for what's right until everybody has a chance to take part in the freedom that was discussed in the beginning.
Can I say how inspiring it is to hear those words, to not stop doing what's right until everyone has a chance to have part of the freedom there for the beginning? And I was really, I've just been reading Lincoln, because this new book is about Hamilton and Jefferson, so I'm in the Civil War period. And just seeing Lincoln come up with that phrase, liberty to all. It's just in a fragment where he says the Constitution is the silver frame around the Declaration's golden apple, but the ideal of America is liberty to all. The founders didn't make that connection between liberty and equality. They thought the two were in tension. He says it's liberty to all, and then it becomes government of, by, and for the people, and the democratic promise embraces everyone, and it's equal opportunity, and that's now the ideal of America.
You know, one of the things that we had at the National Constitution Center was the exhibit on the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments, and how, with the history that you've gone through before that time, we worked to adjust and we worked to get better. How do you see us continuing that work? We haven't had a lot of new amendments in the Constitution here recently, and how do you see us still being able to use those principles and maybe expand on those principles a little bit with what we're dealing with today, right here in Grand Rapids?
Well, the principles of the Reconstruction Amendments are equal protection, equal privileges or immunities, no deprivation of life, liberty, or property without due process of law, equal citizenship, equal rights for all, an equality of rights, liberty to all. The Constitution is always more embracive, to use a beautiful word Justice Ruth Bader Ginsburg used to use. She said, you know, it was initially there were people who were left out, but embracive means embracing the left out people, not just grudgingly but with open arms, and extending those blessings of liberty to previously excluded groups, that 20% that you talked about here in Grand Rapids, and not forgetting them. And that's a promise of the Constitution, and it's that equal opportunity for all has got to be guaranteed.
You know, one of the things that we want to do with this conversation and the conversation tomorrow is kind of bring some of these issues potentially, you know, with attention to the fore, and let's talk about them, and let's try to find a way to overcome them and recognize them, the reality, the depth of them, and try to find the way to use the principles that were also there and say those are the ways to potentially move forward. And I think that as I try to work through these things, in my own mind, because it's easy to wave the flag, but we have to remember all the things that we have done as a nation and all the things that we have to do to get better as a nation. And that's an element that Jeff talks about all the time. You know, during that time too, Jeff has a great podcast, the We the People podcast. I would highly recommend it if you want to dive in deeper on some of these issues. But you talked recently about Native Americans, and certainly women who also were not really part of the Constitution. There's an exhibit at the Constitution that says at this point in time, could you vote? If you were this, if you had this condition or that condition, if you were a landowner or not a landowner. How do we find a way to come together? And maybe that's not a question just for you with the Constitution. That's really a question maybe for all of us. How do we find a way to come together with that baggage and say we can still be better and we can be together? I think there's some history that we have made some steps. Does that give us confidence for the future of how we can stay above the fray, if you will, and try to come to live closer to those ideals?
The Constitution, as Justice Holmes said, is made for people of fundamentally differing points of view. It is a framework for debate. Constitution means constituere, stand together, come together. And we've got to be committed to the framework. The Native American story was remarkable. I mean, the reason this is it's just the best job in the world is that you learn so much, and much is tough. That was a podcast about the jurisprudence of Justice Gorsuch, who's become the leading defender of Native American rights on the Supreme Court, because he's a textualist, and there are clauses of the Constitution that specifically protect Native American rights that the court has ignored. And the most famous decision protecting Native American rights is John Marshall, and the state of Georgia wants to require a license before you can go into Cherokee lands, and this violates the treaties that the U.S. has made with Georgia, and Marshall says that relations between the U.S. and Native Americans are governed by the federal government. And he says, Georgia, you gotta let them in. And Andrew Jackson famously is supposed to have said, Marshall's made his decision, now let him enforce it. He does nothing, steps back. Eventually, Georgia comes to a settlement, but then Jackson, through Indian removal, basically carrying out Thomas Jefferson's initial policy of literally physically removing Indians from the east and putting them west of the Mississippi, uses federal force, and 33,000 Native Americans moved, murdered, and all with federal force, and that's legal. And now we're working out the results of that, and Justice Gorsuch is defending the rights. I'm telling the story, the history is complicated, and you've got to learn it. I don't know this stuff until I have a podcast or do some reading. But it's very important to bring together people to learn the history, and you bring it on both sides. And generally there are arguments on both sides of these debates. And what's so important for you to do, and the reason this is another experiment. We've got an American experiment, and you're trying something in Grand Rapids. Can you bring people together, not to agree about policy, because people aren't going to agree about politics, but to be committed to the conversation and to listen to each other, hear the arguments on both sides, and in that sense, be committed to the project of the Constitution itself.
Jeff, can let me take a bit of a shift and go back to, Jeff just wrote a book called The Pursuit of Happiness, and really explores that phrase. And goes back even before the time of our founding, for this idea that the pursuit of happiness was not about feeling good, it was about being good. Can you give us a little synopsis of what you found and how important that is, that we as people, we always say this in our businesses and in our organizations, right? If you've got good people, it's going to be a great organization. If you've got good citizens, it's going to be a great community. So it goes back to the virtues of who we are and how we can be the best we can be as a fundamental lever to have the best community that we can have. Can you explain or elaborate on on your book and some of the things that you've learned and how it came to be?
It's the most meaningful book I've ever written because it taught me to be a better person as well as a better citizen. And it just came out of left field. I wasn't looking to write a book about this, but I just noticed this weird coincidence that both Ben Franklin and Thomas Jefferson had made this list of 12 or 13 virtues for how to be a good person. And then they both chose as their motto this book by Cicero that I'd never heard of called the Tusculan Disputations. And the motto was, "Without virtue, happiness cannot be." So I thought, I got to read this Cicero. And then I found this reading list Jefferson would send out to kids who wrote to him to ask, how should I be an educated person? And it has not only Cicero, but Seneca, Marcus Aurelius, Epictetus, all these Stoic, Greek and Roman moral philosophers and Enlightenment philosophers too. And I figured, I've just had this great education, law, politics, history. I'd never read these books. I figured I should read them. So during COVID, I did what Jefferson said. He said, you got to get up early before sunrise, watch the sunrise, do reading for 2 hours in the morning, basically read 12 hours a day. And I didn't manage that, but it was COVID. So I did get up before sunrise. I read for 2 hours a day. I watched the sunrise. And it just changed my understanding of the pursuit of happiness. With all of these books, moral philosophy from the Greeks all the way through the Enlightenment, see virtue as, see happiness as virtue. And by virtue, they mean self-mastery, self-improvement, character improvement, being a good person, achieving your potential so that you can be your best self and serve others. They do see things through this dramatic battle between reason and passion. Remember I quoted Madison on the what's a faction? It's reason rather than passion. Well, they applied that to happiness as well and had this idea that comes from Pythagoras and Plato that we have reason in the head and passion in the heart and desire in the stomach. And we have to use our reason to moderate our unreasonable passions and emotions so we achieve the tranquility of soul that allows us to practice the virtues, temperance, prudence, courage, and justice, so that we can be good people. So it completely changed, the way I certainly the way I spend time, because they're very big on not wasting time. And there are all of these essays about industry and using time well. And I'm still trying to get up, and if I don't catch the sunrise, at least read more. And the biggest takeaway from the project is every morning I get up and, it just blows my mind. We have all the books in the world are on my iPhone, but I'm constantly tempted to browse or scroll or read the blogs. And now the new rule is, thinking of Jefferson, I've got to read a book for an hour before I'm allowed to browse or scroll. And it's really good. I'm reading a lot of books and I learned stuff, so that's a good habit. And for them, virtue was all about habits. But the other thing is that it changed my understanding of how to be a good citizen. And I started off by talking about, unless we're, avoid passion, we're gonna have the mob. Madison thinks personal self-government is necessary for political self-government. Unless we are temperate, thoughtful, listen to arguments on all sides, learn about liberty, and practice the habits of deliberation of listening to others, then we're going to go the way of Greece and Rome. It's going to be like Caesar on horseback, demagogues flattering the people, so we exchange our liberty in exchange for cheap luxury, and the whole thing collapses. So that what it taught me, for me it was really personal. Well, it wasn't only self-help, it's a spiritual journey. And for all of these founders, the pursuit of virtue and happiness was a spiritual quest, which they experienced in different ways. But it also reminds me once again about why this mission is so important, because, unless people inform themselves, unless they make thoughtful decisions, we go into groupthink and we don't think for ourselves, and it's really easy for the whole thing to collapse.
Talk a little bit some of the fun parts of you hear all these people that we've learned about in history books, and when they write their lists of the things that they want to do, and then kind of like our country, they didn't always follow them. Share a story or two about that, because you know what? It's kind of like all of us, isn't it? I can't tell you how many lists I've made that I haven't followed, right? And all the things that I'm going to do this, and I'm going to lose weight, but that dessert sure was good. You know, and all those elements, which to me, and I think for us, kind of brings us back to the fact that we're not perfect. We need each other. We need others to round us out. In fact, my mother was really good at that. That was my phrase when I was young. Mom, I get in trouble, say, hey, Mom, nobody's perfect, right? That was my get out of jail free card. And so at one Christmas, she made me a needlepoint. She did little needlepoint pillows, and there was 3 owls on a tree. 2 of them were right side up, and the other one was upside down, and it said, nobody's perfect. And she goes, I'm sick of hearing you say that. So here's your pillow, you know. But I think that's the attitude of humility that we want to have these discussions with. We can learn from these, but we're not preaching. We're not trying to push something down your throat. We're trying to present, and that's what we'll be doing tomorrow too. We're trying to present some ideas that hopefully will help us think through things in a little different way. And we'll deal with tension in a way so we have a way to put it somewhere, to work through it somewhere. And if we use tension in the right way, it can make us better. And when we fail at things, if we're willing to get back up and try again, it can make us better. So how did you see that in your research with some of the books or some of the people who would talk about these things but then recognize that they didn't want to keep track of their list anymore?
Well, those are such great stories, and your incredible mom and dad, who we were celebrating and remembering last night, we're living the Franklin virtues and giving them to you, and you can do it, as your dad would say, and all of those important axioms were really very much in that spirit. Franklin himself recognized that he could never live up to his own system. In his 20s, he resolves to achieve moral perfection. He makes this list of these virtues: temperance, prudence, order, industry. He saves, 2 that he finds hardest for last. First, chastity. He's just fathered kids out of wedlock, and he doesn't want to put that right at the top of his list. And then humility. A Quaker friend, the beautiful invocation that we heard at the beginning, and a Quaker friend told him, that's the one you got to work on. And he imagined, a book by Humility by Benjamin Franklin. He knew it's always a hard thing to practice. But then he has humility. And then he has this grid system where you have the virtues on the bottom and then the days of the week on the right. And you pick a different virtue every week. And at night, you do a self-accounting and put an X in the virtue where you fell short. Well, he tried this for a while. He started with temperance. And there were so many X marks, because he kept losing his temper, that he found it was incredibly depressing. And then he tried, you mentioned not carrying out your resolutions. He was trying to be a vegetarian, and then he smelled cod off the coast of Cape Cod, and then he gave up the vegetarianism and said, well, people always justify what they want to do anyway. And after about a month, he gave up the system, but he felt he was better for having tried it. And that's the point of it. It's not a preachy system, imagining that anyone's perfect. No one is perfect except for Jesus and Socrates, said Franklin, are the only people who are perfect. But we can all try, and it's the process. That's why it's the pursuit. It's not obtaining it. It's the daily, hourly recognition that we're all imperfect, and it's a challenge, it's a struggle, and we're going to fail. But by pursuing it, by trying, we can become a little more perfect together.
And that's the whole idea, I think, Jeff, that we talk about. Let's keep going a little bit further with some of these things, because I always come away so encouraged by the fact that at the National Constitution Center you can take an issue and you can foster really good, thoughtful debate by a lot of people who really believe something. And then they laugh together and they walk off stage together. We had a panel at the recent event in Miami, and they walk away and they keep the debate going, but they don't turn it into a mob scene. And that one of the things that Jeff has organized through the National Constitution Center, a couple things. One, if you ever want to check out the interactive Constitution, if you want to go through the amendments, if you want to go and see what's, the two kind of sides of the argument, if you will, about how the amendment came in place, and then how people look at it from the conservative side or the liberal side, you can kind of get a great, the scholars that have written those sorts of things out, and you can go through that in the interactive Constitution. But you've created this atmosphere where debate is fulfilling. And you don't go to your corners, but you keep the dialogue going. Talk a little bit about how you're able to bring together scholars from the right, left, and center on issues. And the project that you did recently about if you were going to add amendments to the Constitution, what would they be? Just for information, just to see how some of this thinking is going on in circles around our country, and maybe we can start to think of those sorts of things ourselves. Maybe not at the constitutional level in that sense, but maybe we can start to think about things differently here and work together in a new way. So maybe we can use it as an example. So talk a little bit about what some of that work is and what you've done.
Well, as you say, the interactive Constitution is just it's an amazing resource. It blows my mind that we assembled 160 of the greatest constitutional scholars in America from the left and the right. And the people on the right were nominated by the Federalist Society, and on the left from the American Constitution Society. And you can find Justice Amy Coney Barrett and Neil Katyal with 1,000 words about what they agree the habeas corpus clause means, and then separate statements about what they disagree. And multiply that by 80, it's just marvelous to see this model of civil dialogue, and it's just an honor for all of us to be part of it, and to be part of all the other educational materials, the videos, the podcasts, the materials for kids of all ages to teach the Constitution. But that Constitution drafting project was a ray of light. It was just this inspiring sign that maybe important agreement is possible. And again, like many projects, it was an unexpected serendipity. We convened 3 teams, liberal, conservative, and progressive, serious scholars well known on all sides, and asked them to draft constitutions from scratch. To our surprise, their constitutions looked pretty similar and had similar elements. So we decided, well, why don't we just hold a constitutional convention and see if you guys can agree. And in a state of nature or state of Zoom or whatever it was amazing. In just a week of 3 meetings, they agreed on 5 amendments to the Constitution, and here they are. First, term limits for Supreme Court justices. Second, making amendment a little bit easier. Third, making impeachment a little harder in the House and easier in the Senate. Fourth, eliminating the natural-born citizenship requirement for president. And fifth, resurrecting the legislative veto, which is something that Congress was able to do before 1980 when the Supreme Court struck it down, to say if it didn't like something by majority vote, it could repudiate what the president did. None of that was intuitive. They're not the big hot-button issues about abortion or affirmative action. They were structural issues having to do with the nature of government. It's striking that all these teams didn't want to break up with the founders or burn down the Constitution. They wanted to amend it in these thoughtful ways. And the amendments have to do with structural tweaks that are not partisan. They don't favor one side or another. Why did the whole thing work? I think it's first because they were so deeply informed about the Constitution and history. And I was listening to the debates. I felt like I was watching the founders. They were that well informed at like really high level, and people would debate whether an impeached president should be able to run for state office or not, and they cited what George Washington had said about it. So they're really, really informed about the Constitution. They love it, and they're committed to this project of dialogue. They didn't have to agree, but they knew that was the effort. There were no TV cameras. I think that helped, that they were able to kind of deliberate in private and make trade-offs.
And no social media.
And no social media. That's so crucial, so important. Because if you're just tweeting your position, you're going to be tweeting it to your base. The libertarians would be tweeting their base. And by the way, their initial position was they wanted to put one phrase after every clause of the Constitution, and we mean it. They thought no other amendments, just that, although they came around on a bunch of stuff. But isn't that amazing? They almost agreed on an electoral college amendment, too, and for a majority vote. And that amendment almost passed in the 70s. It was supported by Republicans and Democrats, and it was just a bunch of folks who opposed it. But that suggests to me, through everything at the Constitution Center we do not talk about politics. We say, separate your political from your constitutional views, listen to the arguments on both sides, think like constitutional lawyers. You can't have a hasty opinion about a constitutional question. These are tough. I don't know what to think until I've heard the arguments on both sides. You've got to educate yourself. And it's a kind of radical act of faith that American citizens, starting in middle school, and certainly for adult learners, are able to listen to constitutional arguments. And you've talked about, Doug, how it's opened your mind to arguments you hadn't heard before, and as it has all of us. And it's just really exciting to be, it's such an honor to be part of this project of inspiring people to learn about the Constitution, and it does provide a ray of hope that it can take down the partisan rhetoric and reach some unexpected agreement.
Great. I think as you talk about us, and I think, Mayor, you talked about it too, there's politics is part of our life. But if we can get to the higher level and talk about issues that really matter to people and put it in the right perspective, because this experiment is all about self-governance. It's us electing the people to serve our communities. We have a responsibility. And when you hear what Jeff has done and what the Constitution Center has done, and to bring people these are really, really dedicated, smart people who have absolutely landed on their perspective and point of view, but yet found a way to work with people who absolutely run a different perspective and a different point of view, and yet come to agreement on some things. That can give us hope. And I think that's what we wanted to really kind of share here, that these are the principles, this idea, these ideas of freedom and of the rule of law and those other elements are still valid for all of us, and those principles to build on. Maybe one more thing as we get ready to wrap up here, Jeff, one more meaty topic that I'd like to ask you to cover, and that's just this. And you've talked about before this idea, and with regard to freedom of speech, but freedom of conscience, and how it's more. We hear a lot today, and there's a lot going on right now in our country about freedom of speech, what that means, and I don't want to get into the legal piece of it, but the idea behind it was freedom of conscience, of who we are as people. Can you talk about that a little bit? I always found that so powerful, and to go through, make that connection, but maybe to bring it together for us as we kind of start to wrap a little bit.
I find it so incredibly inspiring as well to learn that for the founders, freedom of conscience is the first of the unalienable rights. What does Jefferson mean when he talks about the unalienable rights of life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness? What's an unalienable right? It's a right that I can't alienate to government or to you or to anyone else when we move from the state of nature to civil society and form a government. I can alienate my property because it'll make it more secure if I allow for laws of private property. That's why Jefferson didn't put property, life, liberty, and property in the Declaration, because property is an alienable right. He put the pursuit of happiness because happiness is unalienable because it's based in reason and conscience. That's the connection between freedom of conscience and the pursuit of happiness. I can't command myself or anyone else to think as I please because my thoughts are the product of reason. And because it's inherent in who I am, I cannot alienate or surrender my reason. It's the gift of God. And that is why conscience is an unalienable right. That's why we have to have the freedom to think as we will and speak as we think. That is why government has to be completely disabled from any attempt to control our conscience or direct our thoughts, and that is why it's at the heart of the First Amendment.
Yeah, amen to that, huh? Jeff, thank you for sharing your wisdom, and I want to leave it there because each of us brings talents and gifts and skills and passions and baggage, right? We bring it all, and that's okay. We all got stuff, but we can find a way to figure out how to work together and overcome it and make things better. And if we challenge ourselves to think a little higher, and if we challenge ourselves to maybe listen a little more and have a little more grace in the process, when someone says something we don't agree with, that we can still find a way to build a relationship, create trust, and do great things together. And that's something we can't give away. And we'd never ask anyone to give it away. But we want to ask you to lean in and freely share who you are and what you think. And so as we try to learn these things, and Jeff, your insights and your perspectives and your work at the National Constitution Center, your colleagues are here as well. We're just so grateful. I leave every one of those meetings just feeling further inspired. You know, we're going to be celebrating the 250th anniversary of our country here pretty soon, in a couple of years. And kind of like we started, okay, for a lot of people, so why should I care? I don't know that it's up to us or anyone else to answer that question. It's up to you to answer that question. And as we talk about these things going forward, we're going to try to create times, and we're going to have panels. We're going to kind of bring in some outside thinking, and we're going to try to bring in some people and perspectives of things that we may not have had access to before, but we're going to have some access to them now, and they're going to probably put something in our mind that make us think a little bit differently. That's what this is all about. But it's not to try to tell you what to believe or what to do. It's hopefully to encourage you to be even stronger with what you do believe, and that you're willing to engage with others in the process, to hear what they believe, so we can figure out solutions to the challenges that we face together. So Jeff, thank you for your time. Thank you for the example of the National Constitution Center, for what you do, the work there, and how important that is. And one of the issues early on, I'm a very non-confrontational person. And so as they were talking about the things that the National Constitution Center does, it's a museum, so you wanted to come and see it, feel it. And then there was an education element to it, and it's just been amazing what they've done there on the education side. And then there were these times where you get together and debate. And I said, debate's too strong a word. Can't we tone that down a little bit? And she goes, no, we can't tone that down. We got to have a debate. But he's also found the way to have that debate because we're deeply passionate, and we should be, about our city, about our neighbors, and about each other. So with that, thank you for entertaining us and enriching our lives, educating us, helping us get that perspective. Jeff, I just really appreciate it.
Doug, I must thank you for what you have done as our leader at the National Constitution Center. None of this amazing work that we've accomplished together would take place without your vision, your commitment to nonpartisan dialogue, and your devotion to the Constitution and what you're doing here in Grand Rapids. Friends, Doug is trying to model the same constitutional ideals that he's been inspired with all of us to be championing. And it is an honor to be part of this group, thoughtfully seeking solutions, honestly recognizing failures, but the arc always moving upward. Thank you so much for including me in this great project.
Thank you, Jeff. Joe, back to you.